Welcome to another video tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at local variables, entity properties, and global properties. I'm going to very quickly explain the differences between the three of them, explain what the limitations are of each of them, talk about where and when you would best use each one. So let's start with local variables. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the script editor, and let's just go into the startup script. And I'm going to do all of this via the text. To create a variable, what you do is you type $ and then you give it a name. So let's say my underscore local underscore variable. And then you assign it something. So equals, and then in this case, let's type hello. So this is the syntax for creating a local variable. Variables start with a $sign. That's what tells the Boxite scripting engine that the text immediately following the $sign is the name of a variable. Then the equals sign is how you assign data into that variable. And what follows after the equals sign is tells the variable two types of things. First of all, what the data type is. So you'll see that hello is wrapped in quotation marks. That tells the variable that the data in this case is a string, i.e. text. And then whatever's within the speech marks, in this case hello, that becomes then the data inside the string, hello in this case. However, we could also change the data type and the data. For example, my local variable could equal 5. And now, because it's not only a different value, i.e. it's a 5, but also because it's not wrapped in quotation marks, it's just 5 on its own, the local variable now would be a number variable, and it would contain, in this case, the number 5. We could also make it equal true, and that means the local variable now would be a Boolean variable, i.e. can be either true or false, and in this case, we're setting it to true. You can also do arrays. So array would be typing array and then open and close square brackets. And then within an array, you can have multiple types of data. You could have a string, hello, oops, wrong. You could have hello. You could have 4, 5, whatever, and you could have true. So arrays, we're not going to cover in this video, but it's just to show you that you can also make local variables arrays as well, and they can contain different sets of data, or it can even be game-specific stuff, like, for example, player.model, and that would now be a reference to the data of the player model, okay? So that's how to create local variables. Now, what are the limitations of local variables? The limitations of local variables is that the data stored within them can only be referenced in the script that the variable is assigned in. For example, I should mention as well, there is an exception to this rule, which I'll mention in a minute, but generally on the whole, it's easy to understand as a beginner if you're watching this, that by default, unless you do anything special, local variables data does not travel between scripts. So for example, here we are in startup, and I've just assigned a local variable to the player model, okay? If I was to close this, and let's say I create a new script, and we'll just call this later on. Let's imagine this is a script that's going to fire later on at some point. Maybe we assign it to an NPC interact or something like that. And what we want to do is we want to check, first of all, the state of that local variable. So we could say if $my local variable equals, and when you want to check for something is 2 equals, so equals 2, let's just type player model in this case because that's what I set it to, and then if it's true, we want it to do something, okay? Now, although that looks like it should work, because if we go to our previous script for a second, and see if I can minimize this for a sec. Is there a way of opening two scripts side by side? Yeah. So, oh, yeah, because I didn't save it. So let me just retype this for a second. Dollar my local variable equals player dot model. So although we have in the startup script this text here basically saying that we're making a local variable called my local variable, and inside is the player model. Okay, if we were to save that, that's fine. And then we have a second script over here, which is checking if my local variable equals the player model. Well, that should be true, right? So everything within this if statement should now fire off. That's not the case, because in this script, when this executes, this local variable is actually going to equal null. And I'll explain a little bit more about what null means in a minute. You'll see it in practice. But null basically means that the entity or the variable, whatever the thing is you're checking, is either non-existent or empty of data. In this case, it's empty of data because the data that's stored inside a local variable does not travel between scripts unless you, and this is the exception, unless you pass it deliberately off to another script in functions, which is a bit beyond what I want to cover in this video, which is why I say for now, if you're starting out, just understand that by default, the data you write into a variable in one script, like this, for example, will not be there in another script. Okay, so that's the limitation. So what would be the use for local variables then? If the data doesn't transfer between scripts, what use are they? So let me explain a little bit of the use of local variables very quickly. If you already know enough about local variables, if you're not a complete beginner to programming, then feel free to skip ahead to entity properties. I'll have them chaptered in the video, so you can just go to the next chapter. But if you're a complete beginner and you want to understand a little bit more about these things, then let me just quickly explain why you would use local variables. So there's multiple uses, and I'm sure I'm not going to cover all of them, but I'll give you 3 quick examples. So the first one is it just makes scripting quicker and easier for you when you're typing things out. For example, let's say I create a variable called skill text or something like that. Okay, $skill text is the name of my variable, and I want it to equal the text that's in a widget. Okay, so I would type widget, and I'd reference the widget name or the ID of the widget. So let's just say it was called skill. And then .element would be the element reference of the text field that's got our text in it. And then .text would be the text that's in the field. Okay, so by typing that, what I've done is I've stored in this variable a copy of the data, or a reference, if you will, to the data that's in the widget text field text. Okay, so this variable here is going to contain the exact same text that's in the widget. So if I want to check later on in this script here, not a different one, but in this script, if I want to later check what this text equals, I don't have to type if widget. In other words, I don't have to type all of this out. All I have to do is type if $skill text equals, and then whatever the text is I want to check. So is the skill, for example, speed? I can do it that way. Okay, so it just makes later on, if you're going to be referencing this a lot, then putting it in a variable just means you whenever you need to reference it, it's much quicker. Okay, you can also name these, and this is the second reason why you might use local variables, but it kind of falls into the same reason. Not only is it shorter, but also you can make it make more sense. Like, what does this mean? It's just, it's just a load of, code really. But you can name your variables something that's a little bit more useful for you to understand what's inside this data. So in this case, this is the skill text, or the skill name, So now it's clearer what is inside this variable, what this data actually is, because this could be anything. Obviously, you should know what it is because you're designing it, but just for programming, when you just want to quickly reference what things are, giving them names that actually help you understand what you're referring to. This can also be obviously really useful if you're coding projects with somebody else, a friend or something. Then if they come to this code, they can see, oh, that's skill name, right? Okay, that's what is inside this variable. So it can be very useful, just like commenting. It can be very useful for making your data make a bit more sense. The other use for local variables is that you can use them to manipulate data. For example, let's give a different example here. Let's say we had $health, okay? And we want this to equal player.stat HP. So this is how you grab the player's health. So we're grabbing the player's health and we're storing it in this variable here, $health. But what we could also do is we could make $health equal player stat HP. So in other words, the player's current health minus 5, let's say. So now what will be in this variable is not an exact copy of the data, but a copy of the data with a bit of calculation done. So for example, if the player's health was currently 10, then this $health variable is going to be 10 minus 5. So in other words, this is going to be 5. This variable here is going to contain the number 5. So we can then later check if $health is less than or equal to 5, then do something, okay? And the reason we're doing that is we don't actually want to change the player's health, because if we were to do, player stat HP minus 5, that will actually do it. That would deduct 5 from the player's health. What we want to do is we would just want to check what the player's health would be if it was minus 5. So we store that calculation in a local variable. So this number is going to be different to this number, but it's based off of this number, if that makes sense. And then we can check that number and have our code carry out what it needs to do. So does that make sense why you would use local variables? They're for manipulating data, really, and making things easier as you're sort of retrieving data and using data. But the important point is, once this script has finished executing, that data that's stored in this variable is gone, okay? Unless you pass it on to another script. So if we were, for example, to go to our later on script and do an if statement that says if $health, is less than equal to 5, health will be null at this point, so it won't be a valid if check, so it will default to an else, and it will not do the code that you want. So that's local variables. Hope that's made sense. So how do you then store data? Save, for example, the state of a quest, or save the state of whether a character's been killed or something like that. Local variables obviously aren't going to be the solution because that data is lost once a script is finished executing. So how do you track whether, for example, an NPC is still alive or not? This is where properties come in. And there are two types of properties in RPG in a Box. There's entity properties and global properties. I'll very quickly explain the two, the differences and all of that. So entity properties, first of all, let's start with that. I have an NPC here called Bob, okay? We can go up and we can see he's got an ID of Bob, okay? If we scroll down on the properties for Bob in the map editor, we can see there's a custom properties section. So if we open this up, this is where you would create custom properties for your entities. You can see I've already got one called Given Quest, and this is actually from my Quest starter guide video. So feel free to check that out if you want to understand a bit more about what this particular entity property is doing. But this is where you would create one. So for example, let's say we wanted to create a Boolean. And this is very much like what we were doing earlier with the local variable. You define what type of data goes into this property. So in this case, a Boolean. And then you click Add Property, and you'd give it a name and set the default, whether it's true or false, etc. So that's one way that you can create an entity property. The other is to do it via script. Let me just save this. The other is to do it via script. So let's go to our startup script, for example, and let's type entity, and then you have to give the ID, so in this case Bob, dot property, and then let's create a property on Bob called isAlive, because we want to know, is Bob alive? And we'll set it, assign it to true. Okay, so that's the syntax for creating an entity property. So it's the entity ID and then dot property, because that's what we want to set. And then this is basically the equivalent of the variable name. This would be like typing $isAlive, but in this case it's the property, not a variable. And then you set it to what the data type is, plus also what the data should be. So in this case it's a Boolean, because the data going in is a Boolean value, and we're setting it to true, because Bob should start alive. He's in the map, he's alive. So let's save that. And let's quickly load the game, and I'll just show you how this works. So here I am in the game. I'm going to bring the console down, and I'm going to print. No, I'm going to do it via log message actually. Log message, and then parentheses, and then we want to print entity Bob dot property isAlive, and this should show on the screen what that entity property is set to. And if we close the console, you can see in the top left corner true. So that's showing us that the entity property is true. Okay, so let's go and talk. Well, we don't need to talk to Bob really, but there's Bob. Okay, so Bob is alive, yeah, because his global property is true. Okay, and the nice thing about entity properties, is that the data can be referenced in multiple scripts. So if I had another NPC on this map, I could talk to them and they would know Bob is alive. And so you can have, dialogue that, if Bob's alive, it says one thing, and if he's not, it says another thing. Okay. However, I'm going to now move to a different map. This is map 2. Okay. And here's a goblin. Let's talk to the goblin. The goblin's just said Bob is dead, but that's not true. Bob isn't dead. He's alive, right? The variable is true. So why is that happening? Well, let's bring this down, the console down again, and let's just clear out the log message for a second. And we'll just run that a couple of times just to clear out what's in the log message. And then let's recheck that entity property. See how the text, instead of saying true, it says null. Why is it null? Remember how I said in the local variable section that scripts that didn't define the variable, the data is null. And I said I'd explain a bit more about null when it comes up again. Well, this is it coming up again. Null is our entity property is suddenly null. And it means, as I said, it's non-existent or empty data. Well, why is that the case? Because we just said that entity properties can be shared between scripts. So why is it coming back null? You've got to remember that we've assigned the property to the entity. Okay, we put the property isAlive on Bob, but we are in a different map. Bob isn't in this map. The goblin is, but Bob isn't. We're in a completely separate map. So because Bob isn't in this map, neither is his property. Okay, now I'm going to close the map for a second. Close the game even. And if we go to the map editor and we go to map 2, let me just quickly open it. And I actually didn't even need to do that. We just go to the dialogue editor and we open the goblin's dialogue. Okay, this is the check that the goblin dialogue is doing. It's saying if entity Bob dot property isAlive equals true. That is a perfectly valid if condition. Normally that would work. if the goblin was in the same map as Bob, this would work. The goblin would say Bob is alive, unless we killed him, of course, and changed that property, right? But the goblin instead is saying Bob is dead. And that's because this isn't true, because it's coming back null, not true. So it's important to understand as well that null doesn't mean false, okay? Null is its own thing. So if we had, for example, if entity Bob property is alive true, then say this. Otherwise, if it's false, say this. It won't do the false either. Null is neither of those things. But in this case, because we're only checking whether it's true or something else, it falls back to the something else, okay? Because null is not true, it's something else, right? But the point is, why is this if statement failing? It's failing because this value here in the second map is not existent. So it's going to fail. So how do we then get the goblin to know whether Bob is alive or dead or not? It is alive or not. That's where the global properties come in. So if you want data that's going to be referenced for across the entire game, then that's what you use global properties. So again, there's two ways of defining a global property. One way is to go to game configuration, and global properties is a tab along the top. And just like entity properties, you choose your data type. So we could do a Boolean, can add a property, and we could call this Bob is alive or something like that. We'll get to that in a second, and you would set the default value. Let's do this a different way though. We'll do it via scripts, just so you can learn how to do it via scripts. So let's go back to our startup script. And because we're going to make this a global property, we may as well get rid of the entity property, to be honest, because otherwise it's just a duplicate of the same data. So I'm going to click edit, and I'm going to get rid of this line, and I'll show you how to define a global property. You just type global.property, open square brackets, give it a name. Now, because this is a global property, this is more sort of covering the entire game. If we were to just type is alive, well, who's that referencing? So let's make this more specific. Bob is alive, okay? And this will start equaling true because he is alive, okay? So what we now need to do is apply and save that. We now need to go back to our dialog for the goblin and change the if statement. So instead of checking if the entity property is true, we can now check if the global dot property Bob is alive is equal to true. This will be a lot more accurate because global properties run across the entire game, across all your maps. So if you want data that's going to be referenced no matter what level you're on and where you are in the game, all the characters will know about, you know, if a character's alive or not, or whether you've done a quest or not. Global properties are the utmost, the most sort of topmost level of data. It can be accessed wherever you are in the game. Okay, so let's save this dialog, and let's now go back to the game and see what difference this makes. So remember that when we showed on the top corner of the screen the entity property, it was true in this map, but null in the other. So let's bring the console down now, and let's print, or not print, but let's log message the global. So log message global dot property, and then this is Bob is alive, this one. So let's see if it's set it. True. So it's currently true. So let's go into this map and let's clear it out and see if it's still true. So we want to clear out this and replace it with a couple of speech marks and clear out that. Oh, one more. And then run it again. Let's see what the global is set to now. Still true. So in theory, the goblin now should know that Bob is alive. So let's go talk to the goblin and see what he says. Bob is alive. So that's the difference between the three types. Local variables are the sort of the lowest form of data, and by that I mean they only the script it's contained within, unless you do something special to pass it through to another script. Generally, only that script knows about the data that's in there. Entity properties are the next level up. They are a bit more global, that you can share the data across, but only while that entity exists. So if you leave the map that's got that entity in it, or you kill off that entity and remove it, then you'll lose the property and you'll lose the reference to that data. And in global properties, everything can access it. And, you can always access it unless you change it or get rid of it yourself. So if you absolutely need to have data stored and referenced throughout your entire game, global properties are what you want to use. If you just want something temporary, but you do want to be able to access it quite a bit or quite often, then entity properties are what. Entity properties also make sense if it's to do with the entity. So, it kind of made sense to have is alive on Bob, but it's just the limitation is if we leave the map with Bob in it, then we will need to make it a global property first if we need to reference it. And I should also mention that you can, of course, switch between the properties and local variables anytime you want. So, for example, let's say we had a local variable in startup. Let's edit this quickly. So let's say we had a local variable called my variable, and it equals hello, or it's assigned to hello, whichever. And you wanted to be able to access that throughout your entire game, then you can very easily say global.property and then give it a name. Obviously I typed property wrong. Give it a name, I don't know, let's say this is a greeting property, and you can just set this to $my variable. And now whatever was in that local variable in this script, because you're now writing it to a global property, when this script ends, while this data will get emptied out, this one, because it's a global property, will maintain the data. So in other words, global property greeting will still be hello, okay? This won't equal hello anymore, but this will still equal hello. Does that make sense? Because you've saved the data, you've stored it in a data type that can, or a data container that can be referenced elsewhere. So before I close out, there's one more thing I want to just quickly add about entity properties and global properties if you're assigning them via script rather than the user interface. So here, for example, is a global property that I'm creating, global.property Bob is alive equals true. You need to make sure that you create/define your properties before you check them. So for example, let's say I had a check that says if global.property, and then we'll put in brackets Bob is alive. Let's check if that's true. So equals to true. Then let's say it displays a message. So we'll just quickly say display message. It's true. Okay. This script is fine. Okay. However, if I take this and I cut that from there, and instead I place it there, that script is not going to work. Well, I mean, the script will work, but it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. So the issue that's going to happen now is that this if is going to be false, because this global property, even though we're assigning it to true, we're doing it after the check, right? If you think about scripts, they'd be read from top to bottom, okay, from 1 to, in this case, 5, okay, from line 1 to line 5. That's how scripts are executed, from top to bottom. So in this script, we can see that it's loading the map, and then it's checking if a global property is equal to true, but we haven't set it to true yet, so that's not going to be the case, so it's not going to do this message. And then at the very end of the script, we're saying, set this variable to true. Well, it's too late, right? You've done that too late. So this would need to happen before you do the if check. Now, in a single script like this, that's pretty obvious, right? But you need to be aware that this also happens throughout the game as well, across multiple scripts. So if you had a script where, for example, we weren't setting this property, we were just checking it, right? And in another script, we're setting it. So in a completely separate script, we're setting it to true. But in this script, we're checking if it's true. Then you need to also be mindful that the same top-down fashion still applies to the order of execution of your scripts. So if a script is set to be triggered later on in your game that's checking the state of a property, you need to make sure that at some point before that script is executed, you define that property in a script so that it can be checked and be true if you need it to be true. So generally, good rule of thumb, when you're defining variables via scripts, I think it's generally a good idea to put whatever entity properties, global properties you think you're going to need in the startup script at the end of your startup script. So in this case, my startup script is only doing one thing at the moment. It's just loading this map. But if it was doing other things like playing a cutscene or showing some introductory text or something like that, at the very end of all of that is where I would then define my global properties, my entity properties, etc., so that they're all set up with their default values at the end of this script. So then you don't have to worry about which order they get executed in the rest of your game. You can just then refer to them and set them and all of that. So hopefully that makes sense. It's probably a given, but it's important to mention that if you're going to do properties via script and not via the interface, then if statements and things will only work if that property has been prior set in the script. Okay. So anyway, so with that said, hope this video was in some way helpful and aided in better understanding the differences between the three: local variables, properties, entity, and global. And any questions, feel free to reach out to me on the Discord. But for now, that will wrap up this video. Thank you for watching.